The sandwich landed on Damon Hale's first-class tray with deliberate disdain. Lindsay Brooks's lips curved into a satisfied smile. Damon observed her performance with measured calm, his finger discreetly activating the airline surveillance system he had commissioned as a silent co-owner of Elite Airways. Behind the curtain, Lindsay's derogatory murmurs about how those people didn't belong in first class were recorded perfectly, each word sealing her fate. As Damon documented the treatment with patient precision, his calculated silence while pressing the call button again carried more threat than any confrontation. A quiet resolve that would transform this ordinary flight into the most devastating mistake of Lindsay Brooks's career. Comment where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe. Damon Hale adjusted the jacket of his tailored suit as he settled into seat 2A on Elite Airways, Flight 347 to San Francisco. The soft leather first-class seat embraced him with the familiar comfort he had come to expect from his frequent travels, a small luxury he allowed himself after years of building Hale Technologies from the ground up. Other passengers boarded the aircraft. Damon pulled out his tablet and opened an email containing the quarterly performance reports for Elite Airways, the airline in which he was a silent co-owner through an investment partnership established years earlier. "Good morning," a flight attendant greeted the silver-haired gentleman across the aisle with a warm, welcoming voice. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Langford. Would you like a glass of our house champagne before takeoff?" Before departure, Damon observed the interaction from his peripheral vision while continuing to review the impressive revenue figures on his screen. Elite Airways had seen strong growth in the premium travel segment under his strategic guidance. Though few employees knew of his involvement beyond the boardroom, he preferred it that way, experiencing the airline as any other customer would, gaining insights that quarterly reports and customer surveys could never truly capture. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Lindsay, moved efficiently through the cabin, distributing hot towels and glasses of champagne to passengers in the front rows. Damon noticed her warm smile faded slightly as she approached his seat, her eyes flicking momentarily before settling somewhere just above his shoulder. "Towel, sir?" Her tone clearly cooler than it had been moments earlier with the other passengers. "Yes, thank you," Damon replied, with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to such subtle shifts in treatment. He accepted the towel with a polite nod, watching as Lindsay moved toward the passenger seated behind him. Her voice immediately brightened as she offered champagne and a warm welcome. Damon returned his attention to his tablet, scrolling to review the customer satisfaction metrics he had championed as vital to the airline's performance. The irony did not escape him as he waited for his own pre-departure drink, the one he had specifically requested when booking his ticket, just as he always did. Moments later, the other first-class passengers received their drinks, including a middle-aged couple who had boarded after Damon and now sipped from crystal glasses filled with bubbling champagne. Damon closed his tablet and pressed the call button, his finger lingering for a moment as he considered whether this small battle was worth fighting. With a silent exhalation, he pressed it firmly. Lindsay returned with a tense expression. "Yes, sir. I believe I'm still waiting for my pre-departure drink," Damon said in a measured, professional voice. "I pre-ordered the Macallan 18 when I booked my ticket." Lindsay's eyes darted quickly toward the galley. "I don't see it in our system. In fact, we're running low on premium beverages for this flight. I can offer you orange juice or water instead." Damon glanced over his shoulder, observing the fully stocked bar cart being prepared for service. "That's strange. I received a confirmation email that specifically mentioned my drink preference." He pulled up the email on his tablet and showed it to Lindsay. "Perhaps you could verify it, sir. We have limited stock today," Lindsay responded, her tone growing increasingly dismissive. "The system sometimes overbooks certain items. I'll bring you orange juice." Before Damon could respond, Lindsay had already turned away, leaving him watching as she whispered something to another flight attendant, who glanced in his direction with a barely concealed smile. Damon took a deep breath and returned to his tablet, opening the communication app he used to stay in touch with his executive assistant, Elena. He wrote a brief message. "I'm experiencing some interesting discrepancies in service on Elite Flight 347. It may be nothing, but make a note to discuss it with Diane in HR when I return." The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their imminent departure and thanking passengers for choosing Elite Airways. Damon returned his seat to the upright position and stowed his tablet, watching as Lindsay distributed mixed nuts to the passengers around him. When she reached his row, she placed a small packet of pretzels on his table, the kind typically served in economy class. Before continuing her rounds, Damon examined the packet with clinical detachment that masked the slow burn of realization forming in his stomach. This was not simply poor service or an oversight. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. As the plane began taxiing toward the runway, Damon reopened his messaging app and sent another message to Elena. "On second thought, please contact Diane. I want to know if there have been other service complaints filed by minority passengers in first class recently. And remind me when we installed the surveillance system in the premium cabins." The response came quickly. "The system went live recently across the fleet. All footage is stored for a period. Should I be concerned?" Damon watched as Lindsay and another flight attendant disappeared behind the galley curtain, their whispered laughter drifting back into the cabin. "Not yet," he wrote, "but stay close to your phone. I may need you to make some calls before we land." The plane accelerated down the runway, and Damon felt the familiar pressure against his chest as they ascended into the clouds. What should have been the beginning of a quiet flight was rapidly transforming into something entirely different, a test of patience, professionalism, and principles that would have consequences far beyond this journey. When the seatbelt sign dimmed with a soft tone as the aircraft reached cruising altitude, the cabin crew began preparations for service. Damon closed his eyes briefly, recalling the board meeting years earlier when he had proposed a substantial investment in Elite Airways. His board at Hale Technologies had questioned the wisdom of diversifying into air travel, but Damon had seen an opportunity to help transform an industry plagued by declining service standards and growing customer dissatisfaction. The silent partnership had been strategic, allowing him to observe operations honestly while implementing changes from within the boardroom. Elena's response lit up his tablet screen. HR records show multiple formal complaints from minority passengers in first class during recent periods. Several mentioned flight attendant Lindsay Brooks specifically. A number were dismissed for lack of evidence, and a few resulted in customer vouchers. But no disciplinary action was taken. "The surveillance system is fully operational on your aircraft. Diane is waiting for your call." Damon acknowledged the message with a quick tap, feeling a familiar weight settle on his shoulders. The burden of proof always seemed heavier for some than for others. He slipped the tablet into his jacket pocket as Lindsay approached with the meal cart, her rehearsed smile reappearing as she served the passenger across the aisle. "Mr. Langford, we have your special order. The seared salmon with truffle risotto and a glass of the Montrachet you requested. A gift from the chef," she said, carefully placing the white porcelain plate in front of the silver-haired gentleman. The aroma of gourmet food spread through the cabin as Lindsay continued serving each passenger with attentive care. Damon watched the ritual unfold, noting how she leaned in to explain wine pairings to a young couple, and remembered another passenger's preference for extra bread. When she finally reached his seat, her attitude shifted subtly as she placed a covered plate in front of him, without meeting his eyes. "Your meal," she said in a flat tone, already turning away. Damon lifted the lid to find a dry sandwich on visibly stale bread, accompanied by a small cup of lukewarm apple juice. The contrast between his meal and those of the other passengers, was marked enough to draw curious glances from nearby travelers. "Excuse me," Damon called, his voice calm but firm enough to stop her retreat. "Lindsay, I believe there's been a mistake with my meal. I ordered the chef's special when I booked this flight." Lindsay turned, her expression carefully neutral. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have no record of that order. We're serving what's available." "That's interesting," Damon replied, pulling out his phone to show the confirmation email. "Because I have the confirmation here, along with acknowledgement of my dietary preferences and meal selection in your system." Lindsay barely glanced at the screen. "As I explained about your drink earlier, our system sometimes overbooks certain items. There simply isn't enough premium meal service for everyone today." A passenger across the aisle, Mr. Langford, lifted his gaze from his salmon, fork suspended in midair, as he followed the exchange with barely concealed interest. Damon noticed, but kept his focus on Lindsay. "I see you're serving many premium meals," he observed, discreetly indicating the passengers nearby. "Could you explain why I'm the only one in first class receiving what appears to be an economy meal?" Lindsay's smile tightened. "Sir, we have to prioritize certain passengers according to their status and loyalty program level. I assure you this is standard procedure. I'm a Platinum Elite member," Damon said, his tone firm. "I've flown hundreds of thousands of miles with this airline in recent periods. I'll consult with my supervisor," Lindsay responded, her tone making it clear she had no intention of doing so. She disappeared behind the galley curtain, leaving Damon with the unappetizing meal in front of him. He remained still for a moment, considering his options. Years navigating corporate America as a black executive had taught him the value of choosing his battles wisely. This particular battle, he decided, was worth fighting. Not only for himself, but for the others who had filed complaints, and the many more who simply accepted such treatment as an inevitable reality of their existence. He pressed the call button again, waiting patiently as minutes passed without response. Finally, another flight attendant approached, a young man whose name tag read Tyler. "Can I help you?" Tyler asked, his tone suggesting that helping was the last thing he wanted to do. "Yes," Damon replied, maintaining his professional demeanor. "I'd like to speak with the cabin chief or lead flight attendant about an issue with my meal service." Tyler's eyes narrowed slightly. "Of course. What's the problem?" "I ordered a meal that wasn't delivered, and instead I've been given what appears to be an economy option," Damon explained, aware that several passengers were now openly observing the interaction. "When I asked about it, I was told certain passengers were being prioritized over others, despite my platinum status." "Sir, sometimes we have to make service adjustments during the flight," Tyler said, his voice taking on a condescending tone. "I'm sure Lindsay already explained this. We simply can't accommodate every special request." Damon nodded slowly, noting Tyler's name while he spoke. "I understand adjustments in service. What I don't understand is why everyone around me received the premium meals they ordered, while I received this." He lifted the sandwich, which had begun to curl at the edges as it dried. "Could you explain the criteria being used for these adjustments?" Tyler's posture stiffened. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. You're disturbing other passengers." Damon had not raised his voice at all. He was acutely aware that the only disturbance was the one created by the growing disparity in service. A silent tension settled over the first-class cabin as passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, some deliberately returning to their meals, while others continued watching with open curiosity. "I haven't raised my voice," Damon said calmly. "I'm simply asking for an explanation regarding the service discrepancy." Behind Tyler, Lindsay reappeared, whispering something to her colleague before both retreated toward the galley through the partially open curtain. Damon watched them gather with a third crew member, the three of them glancing occasionally in his direction. Damon returned to his phone, opening his email to find the direct contact information for Diane Rivera, head of HR at Elite Airways. As he drafted a detailed message outlining the ongoing situation, he became aware of a presence beside him. Looking up, he found Mr. Langford standing there, holding his half-finished salmon plate. "I couldn't help overhearing," Mr. Langford said in a low voice. "I've flown this route for years. I've never seen anything like this. Are you all right?" He paused, seemingly weighing his next words carefully. "Would you like me to say something?" Damon appreciated their gesture, but shook his head slightly. "Thank you, but I can handle this." He returned his attention to his phone, adding another paragraph to his email as the crew members continued their whispered conversation behind the curtain, unaware of the silent documentation taking place or the storm gathering on the digital horizon. Damon set his phone down and cautiously examined the sandwich in front of him. The edges of the bread had an unmistakable greenish tint that became more pronounced as he gently lifted the top slice. Dark spots of mold speckled the underside, confirming what his instincts had already told him. This was not simply poor service. It was deliberately malicious. He carefully replaced the bread and pushed the plate away, his appetite completely extinguished by the discovery. "Everything all right with your meal, sir?" Tyler asked again, with a tone carrying a hint of mockery that did not go unnoticed by nearby passengers. "No, it is not," Damon replied calmly, indicating the sandwich. "There is visible mold on this bread. I would like to speak with the captain about this situation." Tyler leaned in, examining the sandwich with exaggerated scrutiny. "I don't see anything out of the ordinary. Perhaps you're mistaken." "I assure you I am not," Damon said, maintaining his composure despite the growing provocation. "This bread is clearly spoiled, and I would like to know why I was served this when everyone else received fresh, high-quality meals." Lindsay appeared beside Tyler, her face flushed with what seemed to be more irritation than shame. "Is there a problem here again?" "Yes, there is," Damon replied, directing his attention to Lindsay. "I've been served moldy bread while everyone around me enjoys their premium meals. I've asked for explanations repeatedly, and so far, all I've received are excuses and dismissals." Lindsay's eyes narrowed. A spark of something darker than simple annoyance crossed her features. "Sir, if you don't like what we've served, you don't have to eat it. But I'm not going to allow you to disrupt this flight with unfounded accusations," Damon repeated, keeping his voice measured despite the clear attempt at manipulation. "The evidence is right here," he pointed to the sandwich. "I would like to know why I'm receiving this treatment when I have been nothing but polite in my requests." "Maybe because some people don't know how to be grateful for what they're given," Lindsay muttered, loud enough for Damon and several nearby passengers to hear. "Always wanting special treatment." The words hung in the air, their implications unmistakable. An uncomfortable silence descended over the first-class cabin as passengers shifted in their seats, some pretending not to hear, while others exchanged knowing glances. Damon felt his pulse quicken, but years of dealing with similar situations had taught him that losing composure would only reinforce the stereotypes people like Lindsay clearly held. "I don't want special treatment," Damon said clearly, his voice firm but still controlled. "I simply want equal treatment, the same meal options, the same service, and the same respect given to any other passenger who paid for a first-class ticket." Lindsay's demeanor shifted, her professional mask slipping further as she leaned toward Damon, lowering her voice. "Listen, I don't know how you got into this cabin, but we both know you don't belong here. So why don't you just stay quiet and be grateful you're not in economy, where you belong?" Tyler interrupted, suddenly realizing several passengers had directed their phones in their direction. "That's enough. Let's discuss this in the galley." As the two flight attendants retreated behind the curtain, Damon exhaled slowly, processing what had just occurred. The woman's prejudices had finally surfaced, explicitly confirming what her actions had already suggested. Damon returned to his phone, This time, opening the Executive Elite Airways application, a secure platform accessible only to senior leadership and major shareholders. With a few taps, he accessed the live feed from the cabin surveillance system, confirming that the cameras were indeed recording behind the galley curtain. Raised voices filtered into the cabin, despite attempts to keep the conversation private. "I can't believe these people." Lindsay's voice emerged clearly during a momentary lull in the ambient aircraft noise. "She probably used points or some diversity program to get here. You saw how he was dressed, acting like he owns the place." Damon's finger hovered over the messaging icon, considering whether to alert Diane immediately or let the situation develop a bit further. The decision was made for Hims when the galley curtain opened and a third crew member appeared. The cabin chief, according to her uniform insignia. "Mr. Hale," she began, her tone professionally neutral, but with underlying tension. "I understand there's been some confusion with your meal service. I want to assure you we take all passenger concerns very seriously." "Thank you," Damon replied, noting her strategic use of his name. Clearly someone had finally checked the passenger manifest. "As I explained to your colleagues, I pre-ordered a meal that wasn't delivered, and instead I received food that appears to be spoiled." The cabin chief nodded, her expression carefully composed. "We're investigating the situation. In the meantime, I can offer you a selection from our executive class menu, if that would be acceptable." "What I find interesting," Damon responded, ignoring the downgraded offer, "is that your colleague suggested this treatment was intentional, with quite specific implications about why I might be receiving it." The cabin chief's professional veneer cracked slightly. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. Lindsay is one of our most experienced flight attendants." "Experience doesn't preclude bias," Damon observed quietly, aware that nearby passengers were still following the conversation. In fact, it sometimes simply provides more opportunity to act on it. The intercom suddenly came to life, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Garrett Shaw. Our flight attendants have informed me of a situation in the first-class cabin. I want to remind all passengers that crew instructions must be followed at all times for safety reasons. No disruptive behavior will be tolerated." The message was clear in its implications. Damon was being framed as the problem. He looked around the cabin, noting how several passengers now regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The narrative was being rewritten in real time, transforming his reasonable request for egalitarian treatment into a disruption that justified the captain's intervention. The cabin chief straightened, emboldened by the captain's tacit support. "Mr. Hale, I must ask you to accept the situation as it stands. We're doing everything possible to accommodate everyone." Damon met her gaze steadily. "What exactly about my behavior has been disruptive? I haven't raised my voice. I haven't made demands beyond asking for the service I paid for. I haven't refused any safety instructions." "Sir, your continued questioning of our procedures is creating tension in the cabin," the cabin chief responded, hardening her tone. "I'm going to have to ask you to drop the matter." Damon registered movement in his peripheral vision. Mr. Langford had risen from his seat again, approaching with deliberate steps. "Excuse me," the silver-haired gentleman intervened, addressing the cabin chief. "I've been observing this situation, and frankly, the treatment this gentleman has received has been appalling. He has been nothing but polite while being served spoiled food and spoken to with condescension." The cabin chief turned to Mr. Langford, her expression softening immediately. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this is a matter the crew must handle." "It is," Mr. Langford challenged, his voice carrying clearly throughout the cabin. "Because from where I'm sitting, it appears to be blatant discrimination. I've flown with Elite for years and have never witnessed such poor service or disrespect toward a passenger." A murmur of agreement rose from several other passengers. The tide of opinion was visibly shifting as people began connecting the dots between Damon's treatment and the color of his skin. The cabin chief's expression tightened as she realized she was losing control of the narrative. "We'll bring you something from the executive class menu immediately, Mr. Hale," she said abruptly, turning on her heel to retreat to the galley. "That won't be necessary," Damon called after her, his voice calm but clearly audible. "What is necessary is an explanation of why I'm being treated differently from everyone else in this cabin." The cabin chief paused, visibly unsettled by the direct challenge to authority. Before she could respond, the galley curtain opened again, and Captain Garrett Shaw appeared, his face marked by severe lines as he surveyed the first-class cabin. His gaze settled on Damon with unmistakable hostility. "Sir," the captain began, his voice laden with the weight of ultimate authority on the aircraft, "I understand you're causing a disturbance. I need to inform you that if this behavior continues, I will be forced to divert the flight for the safety of all passengers." The threat hung in the air as Damon calmly took his tablet and opened his executive email with deliberate movements. "Captain Shaw, I suggest you reconsider that action. I have not caused any disturbance, as numerous witnesses in this cabin can attest. What I have done is question why I've been singled out for inferior service and disrespectful treatment." The captain's expression darkened. "Sir, as commander of this aircraft, my determination of what constitutes a disturbance is final. I'm giving you one last chance to comply with crew instructions and cease this disruptive behavior." "What specific instruction have I not followed?" Damon asked, his finger hovering over the send button on an email addressed to the airline's board of directors. An email that would reach their phones long before the plane could land at any diverted airport. The captain did not respond immediately, perhaps realizing the weakness of his position. In the momentary silence, the cabin chief leaned forward to whisper something in his ear. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. A flicker of uncertainty appeared in his eyes. "This isn't about complying with instructions," Damon continued, seizing the moment of hesitation. "This is about being treated with basic dignity and receiving the service every passenger in this cabin has paid for. The only disturbance has been created by the discriminatory actions of your crew." A headache began to form at Damon's temples as he maintained eye contact with the captain. Neither man was willing to yield in what had transformed from a simple service issue into a defining moment of principle. Behind them, the cabin had fallen completely silent, the collective attention of every passenger fixed on the confrontation unfolding before them. The captain's authoritative presence loomed over Damon as the standoff continued. Every passenger in the cabin was now fully invested in the drama unfolding in real time. It seemed to slow as Damon weighed his options, his mind racing through possible outcomes with the strategic precision that had guided his business decisions for years. He could yield, accept the inferior treatment, swallow his pride, and maintain the peace everyone around him seemed so desperate to preserve. It was the path of least resistance, one he had taken in his younger years, when building his career had seemed more important than challenging the subtle indignities he faced daily. The memory of those compromises now left a bitter taste in his mouth, far harder to swallow than the moldy bread he had been served. Or he could stand firm, not only for himself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or dehumanized because of the color of their skin. The surveillance cameras were recording. Witnesses were watching. The evidence existed. This was no longer simply about a meal, but about accountability in a system designed to avoid it. Captain Shaw finally spoke. "Mr. Hale," his voice carrying a quiet force that demanded attention. "Before you make a decision that will affect everyone on this aircraft, I believe there's something you should know." "I've already made my decision," the captain interrupted, his jaw clenched with barely contained anger. "This is my aircraft, and I will not tolerate any passenger undermining the authority of my crew." Damon nodded slowly, his finger hovering over the send button on his tablet. "That is precisely the problem, Captain. You've made a decision based on incomplete information. Not once have you asked for my perspective on what's occurring, and yet you're prepared to inconvenience hundreds of passengers by diverting. The captain's eyes narrowed dangerously. Sir, this is your final warning. Comply with crew instructions immediately, or I will be forced to declare an emergency and land. And what instruction would you like me to comply with? Damon asked, maintaining his composure despite the rising tension. So far, I've been told to accept spoiled food, be grateful for discriminatory treatment, and remain silent when subjected to racial prejudice. Which of these instructions do you believe is reasonable or legal? A spark of uncertainty crossed the captain's face, quickly masked by renewed determination. This isn't about race. This is about maintaining order in my cabin. It became a matter of race the moment your flight attendant decided I didn't belong in first class, Damon countered, his gaze steady. It became a matter of race when I was served spoiled food while everyone around me received their proper meals. It became a matter of race when your crew member made explicit comments about my presence here. Behind the captain, Lindsay had emerged from the galley, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and anxiety as she realized the situation was slipping from her control. Captain, perhaps we should— Mr. Hale is right. Mr. Langford's voice cut through the tension, drawing all eyes to the silver-haired passenger who had risen to stand beside Damon. Just as several others in this cabin observed, your flight attendant made explicitly racist comments and served this gentleman spoiled food. If you divert this flight, you will be doing so only to punish a passenger for calmly asking to be treated with basic human dignity. Murmurs of agreement spread through the cabin as other passengers began voicing their support. A woman across the aisle raised her phone. I've recorded parts of this interaction. The flight attendant clearly said he doesn't belong in first class despite his platinum status. Captain Shaw's authority was visibly eroding as the collective testimony of the cabin united against the narrative he had been given. His gaze moved rapidly between passengers, the growing chorus of dissent undermining his position with each passing moment. Captain, Damon said in a deliberate tone, I'm giving you an opportunity to handle this situation professionally. You can address the discriminatory behavior of your crew, or you can escalate the problem by diverting this flight without cause, a decision that will have consequences far beyond today. The implication hung unspoken, but clear. The captain's jaw worked silently as he processed his increasingly limited options. Behind him, Lindsay disappeared again behind the galley curtain, the sound of urgent whispers reaching faintly into the cabin. Damon maintained his steady gaze on the captain, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. The confrontation had reached its breaking point. Backing down would only strengthen the behavior he had witnessed, not only on this flight, but throughout the airline he co-owned. The responsibility to act weighed on his shoulders, a burden he had carried throughout his career while navigating spaces never designed for people like him. With deliberate calm, Damon pressed the send button on the email he had composed to the airline's board of directors, an email detailing the discriminatory treatment he had experienced and requesting an immediate review of the aircraft's camera footage. The soft confirmation sound seemed to echo in the tense silence of the cabin. I've just contacted the airline's executive team, Damon said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the now silent cabin. I've requested they review the footage from this flight, which I believe will provide conclusive evidence of the treatment I've received. I've also asked them to prepare for the possibility that you divert this flight without legitimate cause. The captain's expression darkened at the direct challenge to his authority. Camera footage? There are no cameras in this cabin. Actually, Captain Shaw, Damon corrected, his tone direct. The premium cabin surveillance system was installed recently across the fleet. Every interaction in this cabin during the past hour has been recorded and stored on the airline's secure servers, including the conversations that took place behind that curtain. Color drained from Captain Shaw's face as the implication registered. Behind the galley curtain, Damon could hear Lindsay's voice rising in panic, though her words were indistinguishable. The captain's hand moved toward his communication device, but hesitated, suddenly uncertain of his next move. "Captain," Damon continued, seizing the moment of doubt. "I understand you're in a difficult position. Your crew has given you incomplete information, and you're trying to maintain order on your aircraft. But the facts of this situation are not in dispute. They have been witnessed by multiple passengers and recorded by the cabin surveillance system. The question now is how you choose to proceed." The intercom crackled suddenly, and a flight attendant's voice announced from the flight deck. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your first officer. We're experiencing some technical issues with our originally planned routing. The captain will return to the flight deck momentarily to assess the situation. Please remain in your seats with seatbelts fastened until further notice." The announcement was clearly a pretext, and transparent attempt to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation. Captain Shaw's expression had shifted from authoritative confidence to barely concealed concern as he realized the potential consequences of his actions. Without saying another word, he turned and headed toward the flight deck, leaving the first-class cabin in a buzz of whispered conversations and speculative glances. The cabin chief approached Damon cautiously, her demeanor markedly different from minutes earlier. "Mr. Hale, I want to apologize for the misunderstanding. We'll bring you a proper meal immediately." "This is no longer about the meal," Damon replied calmly. "This is about addressing a pattern of discriminatory behavior that appears to be tolerated within this airline." The cabin chief's professional mask slipped, revealing genuine anxiety beneath. "Sir, I assure you Elite Airways has strict policies against any form of discrimination. This was an isolated incident." "It was not," Damon interrupted, his voice firm but calm. "Because according to the airline's own records, there have been multiple formal complaints from minority passengers in first class in recent periods. Several specifically mentioned flight attendant Lindsay Brooks. A number were dismissed for lack of evidence, and some resulted in customer vouchers, but no disciplinary action was taken. That doesn't sound isolated to me. That sounds systemic." The cabin chief's eyes widened at the specific information. Details only someone with access to the airline's internal HR records could know. She took a step back, suddenly uncertain about exactly who she was dealing with. Behind the galley curtain, Damon could hear Lindsay's voice rising in distress. "How does he know about the cameras? Nobody told us there were cameras. What else does he know?" The intercom sounded again, and the captain's voice, now tense and with forced professionalism, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Shaw. After consulting with air traffic control, we've determined it's necessary to make a small diversion from our flight path. We'll be landing at Denver International Airport in approximately an hour to address a technical concern. We apologize for any inconvenience and expect to resume our journey to San Francisco after a brief stop. Flight attendants, prepare hair for landing." Damon exhaled slowly, recognizing the decision for what it was. An attempt to remove him from the plane without explicitly calling him the problem. The captain was choosing escalation over accountability, punishment over resolution. When the announcement ended, Damon opened his messaging app again, typing a brief but decisive message to Elena. "Confirmed landing in Denver. Full intervention required. Contact Diane immediately. I want her team waiting at the gate. Complete surveillance review. Captain Shaw is diverting to remove me from the flight." The response was instantaneous. "Understood. Diane is en route to Denver now. The board has been notified. Expect further updates." Around him, passengers began murmuring, frustrated by the unexpected delay. A businessman checked his watch with visible irritation while a young couple whispered anxiously about connecting flights. The effects of the discrimination Damon had experienced now rippled throughout the aircraft, affecting every passenger's journey, a microcosm of how unchecked prejudice inevitably harms everyone, not just its original target. As the plane began its descent into Denver, Damon reclined in his seat, his expression calm despite the storm raging around him. The weight of what was coming settled over him, not fear, but the familiar resolve of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for moments exactly like this. When the aircraft touched down and taxied to a remote stand, the cabin door opened to reveal not ground crew, but a team of elite Airways executives. Diane Rivera led them, her expression grave as she strode purposefully down the aisle toward the flight deck. "Captain Shaw," she began, her voice professional, but several degrees cooler as she addressed him. "That won't be necessary. Mr. Hale will not be removed from this flight." Confusion flooded the captain's face. "Ma'am, I've made the determination." "Your determination has been overridden," Diane interrupted firmly, turning to acknowledge Damon with a respectful nod. "Mr. Hale, on behalf of Elite Airways, I want to extend our most sincere apologies for what you experienced today. The behavior exhibited by certain crew members is completely unacceptable and goes against our core values." The captain's expression shifted rapidly from disbelief to anger to growing comprehension as he processed the implications of Diane's presence and her differential treatment toward the passenger he had been attempting to remove. "Ms. Rivera, with all due respect, I am the commander of this aircraft." "No, Captain," one of the executive officers interjected, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "You and your crew will be removed from duty pending a full investigation. A replacement crew is already boarding through the rear entrance. They will complete this flight to San Francisco once this matter is resolved." The captain's face paled as he realized the full gravity of the situation. His gaze shifted to Damon, reevaluating the passenger he had so easily dismissed, struggling to reconcile his presence with the corporate response now unfolding. "Who exactly are you?" he asked. His voice barely audible. Damon held his gaze steadily. Years of navigating both subtle and overt discrimination had prepared him for this moment of accountability. "Someone who believed your airline could be better," he responded simply. "Someone who still believes it can." The first-class cabin had fallen completely silent. Passengers sat frozen in their seats as they witnessed the dramatic reversal of fortune unfolding before them. Captain Shaw remained rigid, his authority stripped in full view of the entire cabin. Lindsay and Tyler lingered uncertainly at the edge of the galley, their expressions alternating between defiance and dismay. As Diane continued addressing the situation with clinical efficiency, she called out the flight attendants. "Ms. Brooks, Mr. Tyler," Diane said, her tone firm but controlled. "Please gather your belongings and prepare to disembark immediately. Your credentials have been temporarily suspended, pending a full investigation into today's events." Lindsay stepped forward, indignation overriding her surprise. "This is ridiculous. We haven't done anything wrong. That passenger was being difficult and making unreasonable demands. The captain made the decision to divert the flight for everyone's safety." Diane's expression remained impassive as she raised her tablet, showing what were clearly surveillance recordings from the cabin. "Ms. Brooks, we have complete audio and video documentation of every interaction that occurred on this flight, including your conversations behind the galley curtain. I suggest you comply with this directive without further incident, which would only aggravate your current situation." Color drained from Lindsay's face as comprehension dawned. Her gaze moved from Damon to the ceiling panels, where the discreet cameras were hidden. Cameras whose presence now became unmistakable once she knew where to look. "You can't. This is an invasion of privacy. We weren't informed about surveillance." Page 17 of your employment contract and page 4 of the flight attendant manual clearly state that all premium cabins are subject to monitoring for quality control and security reasons. Diane responded without hesitation. This policy was implemented recently, and all crew members were notified through multiple channels, including the mandatory training sessions you signed, acknowledging you completed. Damon observed the exchange with an outward calm that contrasted with the complex emotions crowding inside him. There was no satisfaction in seeing these individuals face consequences, only a weary recognition that accountability was a necessary part of progress. The surveillance system he had advocated for was designed primarily to improve safety and service quality. Its role in documenting discrimination had been a contingency he had hoped would never be necessary. Captain Shaw turned to Damon, his professional demeanor cracking under the pressure of public humiliation. "You planned this, didn't you?" he said with contempt. "You boarded my aircraft looking for trouble, baiting my crew into making a mistake." "Captain Shaw," Damon replied calmly, "I boarded this flight with the same expectation as any other passenger, to receive the service I paid for, and to be treated with basic dignity. The only thing I planned was a business trip to San Francisco. Everything that followed was the result of decisions made by you and your crew." The captain's jaw worked silently, searching for a response that wouldn't incriminate him further. Finding none, he turned abruptly. Captain Shaw walked toward the exit, his posture rigid, a final attempt to preserve what remained of his dignity. Lindsay and Tyler followed reluctantly, casting venomous glances at Damon as they passed. When the disgraced crew members disappeared down the jet bridge, a collective sigh seemed to ripple through the cabin. The tension that had built during the past hour began to dissipate, replaced by a murmur of whispered conversations as passengers processed what they had witnessed. Several took out their phones, undoubtedly composing social media posts that would spread the story far beyond this aircraft. Diane approached Damon, lowering her voice to maintain some privacy in the crowded cabin. "Mr. Hale, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry we are for what occurred today. This is a complete failure at multiple levels, and I assure you it will be addressed thoroughly." Damon nodded, appreciating her professionalism, while recognizing that this moment required more than standard corporate damage control. "Thank you, Diane. I know this doesn't represent the company's values, at least not the values we aspire to, but clearly there are systemic issues that need addressing." "Absolutely," she agreed, her expression grave. "The replacement crew will be aboard shortly, and they will complete the flight to San Francisco. In the meantime, is there anything we can do to make this right for you?" Damon considered the question, looking at the passengers who were still observing the exchange with attention. Some appeared sympathetic, others uncomfortable, and some openly resentful of the delay. In that moment, Damon made a decision that transcended his personal experience, one that recognized the collective impact of discrimination, even when directed at an individual. "Yes," he responded, his voice quiet but firm. "But I would like to address all the passengers once the new crew is settled. This disruption has affected everyone on this flight, and they deserve an explanation." Diane nodded, understanding the implications of his request. "Of course. The captain and replacement crew should be here within minutes. I'll arrange for you to use the intercom system." As Diane moved away to coordinate with ground staff, Damon's phone vibrated with another message from Elena. "The board chairman wants to speak with you urgently. Media is already picking up rumors about an elite airways diversion involving discrimination. How do you want to handle this?" Damon typed a quick response. "Tell the chairman I'll call him once we're airborne again. As for media, no comments until I've addressed the passengers and we've gathered all facts. Have legal. Prepare a statement emphasizing our commitment to addressing the incident transparently and completely. This isn't just about damage control. It's an opportunity for meaningful change." He had barely sent the message when another notification appeared, an alert from a news outlet mentioning Elite Airways and an unscheduled landing due to allegations of discriminatory treatment. The digital age meant even events occurring at cruising altitude couldn't remain isolated for long. By the time they reached San Francisco, This incident would likely be making headlines across the country. Mr. Langford leaned across the aisle again, his expression thoughtful. "Quite a turn of events," he observed quietly. "I've flown with this airline for years, and never imagined I'd witness something like this. Part owner, I take it?" Damon smiled slightly, appreciating the man's perceptiveness. "Silent partner. I prefer to experience the airline as a regular passenger. It provides insights you can't get from quarterly reports and customer satisfaction surveys." Mr. Langford nodded, appreciating the intelligent approach. "Though I imagine today's insights weren't what you had in mind." "No," Damon agreed, his expression serious. "But perhaps they were necessary. Some problems remain invisible until they're experienced firsthand." Their conversation was interrupted when the cabin door opened and the replacement crew boarded. The new captain, a woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair and an air of experienced professionalism, moved directly to the intercom system. Her voice filled the cabin moments later, clear and authoritative, without the defensive tone that had characterized Captain Shaw's communications. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sophia Reyes. I understand today's flight has experienced some unexpected challenges. My crew and I will be taking command from this point forward, and we expect to have you on your way to San Francisco within 20 minutes. We appreciate your patience and understanding during this transition." The announcement was met with scattered applause from passengers, relieved that their journey would soon continue. Captain Reyes made her way through the first-class cabin, pausing briefly at Damon's seat to introduce herself properly. "Mr. Hale," she said with a firm, direct handshake. "I want to personally assure you that my crew and I are committed to providing excellent service to all our passengers, without exception. I understand you'll be addressing the cabin before we depart." Damon nodded, appreciating her straightforward approach. "Yes, with your permission. I believe the passengers deserve to understand why their travel plans were disrupted today." "I completely agree," she responded. "Just let me know when you're ready." Captain Reyes continued toward the flight deck. Diane returned to Damon's side with a folder containing several documents. "These are the preliminary reports on the incident based on surveillance footage and witness statements we've already collected. We'll conduct more thorough interviews once we reach San Francisco, but I wanted you to see the initial documentation." Damon reviewed the reports carefully, noting the clinical precision with which they detailed the discriminatory comments and actions. The evidence was overwhelming and unequivocal, stripped of the emotional context that had made the experience so dehumanizing. On paper, reduced to timestamps and transcribed dialogue, the incident seemed almost mundane, a routine case of prejudice documented with corporate efficiency. But Damon knew better. He had felt the weight of those dismissive glances. He had experienced the humiliation of being served spoiled food while others ate gourmet meals. He had endured accusations of disruption when he had simply asked to be treated with basic dignity. These were the realities reports could never fully capture, the lived experiences that policies alone could never address. As the replacement crew finished their preparations and passengers settled back into their seats, Damon rose and made his way to the front of the cabin, where Diane waited with the intercom handset. The moment had arrived to transform an individual injustice into a catalyst for collective change, to address not only what had occurred on this flight, but what happens every day in boardrooms, restaurants, stores, and public spaces across the country. He accepted the handset from Diane, taking a deep breath as he prepared to address the passengers whose journeys had unexpectedly intertwined with his own. The cabin fell silent in anticipation, every eye focused on the man whose quiet dignity in the face of discrimination had brought them to this unprecedented moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Damon began, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin intercom. "My name is Damon Hale. I want to take a moment to address what happened today and why your journey was disrupted. The cabin remained absolutely silent as passengers in both cabins listened attentively, united by curiosity about the drama that had unfolded and resulted in an unscheduled landing. Some of you witnessed the interactions in first class that led to this diversion. What began as a simple request for the meal I had pre-ordered escalated into something far more serious when I was deliberately served spoiled food and subjected to discriminatory treatment based on my race. A ripple of reaction moved through the cabin, nods of confirmation from those who had witnessed the events firsthand, expressions of shock from those in economy class hearing the details for the first time. When I questioned this treatment, the crew responded by characterizing me as disruptive and aggressive, ultimately convincing Captain Shaw to divert the aircraft to Denver, not for any legitimate safety concern, but in an attempt to remove me from the flight. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the cabin as passengers processed this revelation. Damon continued, his tone remaining measured and dignified. What the crew didn't know is that I'm not just a passenger. I'm a silent co-owner of Elite Airways. I made a substantial investment in this airline with the belief that we could build a company that truly values every customer, regardless of appearance or background. As part of that commitment, I implemented a surveillance system in all premium cabins to monitor service quality and ensure the highest standards for all passengers. The revelation landed with palpable impact. Passengers exchanged glances of surprise and understanding as the pieces fell into place. In economy class, several passengers had stood up from their seats to better hear his words, while flight attendants stood motionless in the aisles, absorbing the implications of his declaration. The surveillance captured everything that occurred today, from the initial discriminatory service to the explicit comments made behind the galley curtain, to Captain Shaw's decision to declare an emergency landing based on false information. The footage has already been reviewed by our HR and legal departments, resulting in the immediate removal of the responsible crew. Damon shifted his focus, his expression softening as he addressed the collective impact of the incident. I understand that all of you have been inconvenienced by this diversion. Your time is valuable, and this delay has disrupted your plans and schedules. For that, I sincerely apologize. He paused, knowing that what he said next would transform the mood of the entire aircraft. Damon continued, "To acknowledge this inconvenience and demonstrate our commitment to addressing this incident appropriately, Elite Airways will provide a full refund of today's ticket price to every passenger on this flight, along with $1,000 in compensation and 5 years of complimentary elite status upgrades." A stunned silence fell over the cabin, quickly followed by exclamations of surprise and scattered applause that grew into sustained ovation. In economy class, passengers who minutes earlier had been frustratedly checking connecting flight schedules now looked toward the front in disbelief, the substantial compensation far exceeding anything they could have expected from a flight delay. "This compensation isn't just about today's inconvenience," Damon continued as the applause faded. "It's a recognition that discrimination affects everyone, even those who aren't its direct targets. When we allow injustice to pass unchallenged in our presence, we become part of the environment that enables it." He handed the intercom to Diane, who stepped forward to provide the practical details of how the compensation would be processed. As she spoke, Damon returned to his seat, suddenly aware of the emotional toll the confrontation had taken. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the intense exchanges was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a familiar fatigue, the cost of holding one's ground on something that should never have needed defending in the first place. Passengers from both cabins began approaching his seat, forming a line that stretched down the aisle. Some simply wanted to shake his hand, others to share their own experiences with discrimination, and many expressed admiration for how he had handled the situation. A young black woman from economy class leaned in to whisper, "Thank you for not letting it go. Most of us can't afford to fight that way." Her words struck Damon deeply, highlighting the privilege that had allowed him to challenge his treatment, where others might have had to endure it in silence. His position and resources had given him an advantage many didn't have, a reality that reinforced his responsibility to use that advantage for systemic change, rather than personal vindication alone. When the last passengers returned to their seats and the plane prepared for departure, Mr. Langford settled back beside Damon, his expression thoughtful. "You made an important statement, both with words and actions." Damon nodded, looking out the window as the Denver landscape began to recede below them. It seemed appropriate. Some lessons need to be costly to be remembered. $10,000 per passenger is more than costly, Mr. Langford observed. That's a corporate statement if I've ever seen one. "The money isn't the point," Damon responded quietly. "What matters is that everyone on this plane now has a stake in this story, not just as witnesses, but as participants. They'll remember this flight not for the discrimination they saw, but for the accountability that followed." Mr. Langford nodded slowly. "You're playing a longer game than simply addressing one incident." "I have to," Damon said, watching as clouds enveloped the aircraft as they climbed toward cruising altitude. "Because this was never just about one flight, one crew, or one airline. It's about challenging the assumption that certain spaces aren't meant for people who look like me, and the cruelty that reinforces those boundaries when they're crossed." As the plane leveled and service in the cabin resumed, now delivered with impeccable professionalism by the replacement crew, Damon opened his tablet to begin drafting the presentation he would deliver to the board the following day. The surveillance footage provided irrefutable evidence of individual misconduct, but his task now was to illuminate the broader patterns that had allowed such behavior to flourish unchecked. His phone vibrated with an incoming call from board chairman Robert Lang. Damon answered, prepared for the difficult conversation ahead. "Damon," Lang began without preamble, "I've just reviewed the preliminary reports and the footage. It's disturbing, to say the least." "That's putting it mildly," Damon responded, keeping his voice low despite the ambient cabin noise. "The financial impact of your compensation offer will be substantial. The board will have questions." Damon had anticipated this concern. The financial cost of allowing this culture to persist would be far greater in the long term. Lost customers, litigation, sustained reputational damage. Consider this an investment in the company's future, not an expense. There was a brief silence on the line as Lang processed this perspective. "You've never been one for impulsive decisions, so I trust your judgment here. But this incident will be national news by tomorrow," he warned. "Which is why our response must be equally newsworthy," Damon countered. "I'm preparing a comprehensive proposal for systemic reforms across the airline, new training protocols, accountability mechanisms, and revised hiring practices. I'll present it to the board tomorrow morning. Some members will resist," Lang warned. "They'll argue this was an isolated incident, not a systemic problem." "Then I'll show them the data," Damon countered firmly. "Multiple formal complaints from minority passengers in first class during recent periods, most dismissed without proper investigation. That's not isolated. That's a pattern." Lang sighed, the sound of someone recognizing the magnitude of the challenge ahead. "You have my support, Damon. This isn't just morally right. It's the right decision for the business. I'll see you at the emergency board meeting tomorrow." When Damon ended the call, he noticed several passengers around him openly checking their banking apps with exclamations of surprise, confirming that the promised compensation was already being processed. Diane had worked quickly, ensuring the corporate response matched the urgency of the situation. It was a good beginning, but only the first step in a much longer journey. The remainder of the flight passed without incident. the replacement crew demonstrating the standard of service Damon had always envisioned for Elite Airways: professional, attentive, and most importantly, consistent for every passenger, regardless of appearance. As they began their descent into San Francisco, Damon finalized his notes for the board presentation, knowing tomorrow would be a defining moment, not only for his role in the company, but for the future of the company itself. The Elite Airways response team was waiting for Damon when he deplaned in San Francisco. The gravity of the situation was evident in their expressions. James Peterson, the director of operations, stepped forward immediately. "Damon, I've reviewed the footage. It's unacceptable," James said, extending his hand. "Yes, it is," Damon replied firmly. "And now we need to ensure it never happens again." The chairman had called an emergency board meeting for the following morning at 8. The story was already spreading across all platforms. Within the executive terminal, analysts had set up a command center displaying data from customer feedback systems. A young data scientist pointed to a screen showing customer satisfaction metrics. "We've identified a clear statistical disparity in satisfaction scores between white passengers and passengers of color in premium cabins," she explained, highlighting several graphs, particularly on routes served by certain crew rotations, and many of these discrepancies triggered no investigations. "How many of these discrepancies triggered investigations?" Damon asked. Diane stepped forward. "Very few. Our systems classified complaints as isolated incidents unless multiple reports pointed to the same employee within a short period. Or perhaps," Damon said, pointing, "it was designed precisely not to identify those patterns." James winced. "The surveillance system you implemented has revealed discrepancies we simply couldn't see before." "Couldn't or wouldn't?" Damon challenged. "Systems reflect priorities, James, and our priority now must be accountability, not damage control. Which is why I've already initiated a full audit of all discrimination complaints received in recent periods," Diane interjected, "including those that were dismissed." An alert appeared on the main screen, showing statements from Lindsay Brooks and Captain Shaw, alleging a misunderstanding and suggesting Damon had leveraged his position for revenge. The general counsel approached with tablet in hand. "The compensation package is making headlines. The board will have questions. They can question the cost of addressing this incident," Damon responded, "or they can consider the far greater cost of not addressing it." Damon stepped away to call Elena in New York. "The footage has been fully backed up, correct?" he asked. "Triple secured," Elena confirmed. "Copies on our servers. Legal's servers and your private cloud. They can't dispute it." "Good. Because tomorrow is when the real work begins. Today was about addressing one incident. Tomorrow is about changing a system." A message from Robert Lang appeared on Damon's phone. Media requests flooding his line. They wanted statements, interviews. How did he want to handle it? "No interviews yet," Damon replied after a moment. "Issue a statement acknowledging the incident, confirming immediate action was taken, and announcing comprehensive reforms to be presented tomorrow. Keep the focus on systemic change, not personal drama." A middle-aged black executive approached Damon, lowering her voice. "I've been with this airline for years. What happened to you has happened to countless others who couldn't fight back. Thank you for using your position to force this conversation." Damon met her gaze. "This isn't just my fight. And the changes we make can't be only to protect executives in first class." She nodded. "The board won't make this easy. Some will try to minimize it, contain the damage rather than address the root. Then we'll need to make the evidence impossible to ignore," Damon said. "Tomorrow isn't just about one flight or one crew. It's about acknowledging a reality that's been hiding in plain sight for too long." As the response team continued their preparations, Damon observed the command center with its screens showing social media reactions, news coverage, and internal data. The incident had forced a long overdue accountability, but the fact that it had required such dramatic circumstances to provoke action was itself an indictment of how deeply rooted the problems were. James called Damon from across the room. "I want to see the complete service records of every crew member who received discrimination complaints in recent periods. And I want to know exactly how those complaints were handled, who reviewed them, and what actions were taken." "Those are hundreds of files," James protested. "Then we'd better get started," Damon responded without hesitation. "Because tomorrow, the board receives every single one." While the Elite Airways boardroom fell silent as Damon concluded his presentation, laying bare the evidence of systemic discrimination before the assembled executives. The surveillance footage from the flight played one final time on the main screen. The contempt in Lindsay's expression, Captain Shaw's baseless accusations, and the explicitly racial comments captured behind the galley curtain. "Ladies and gentlemen," Damon said, his voice steady as he observed the board members' reactions. "What we witnessed was not an isolated incident, but a manifestation of deeper cultural problems within our organization. The audit had identified dozens of similar complaints that were dismissed without proper investigation in recent periods." Charles Whitfield, a senior board member with decades in the industry, leaned forward with a skeptical expression. "While I agree the behavior was unacceptable, isn't the compensation package excessive? We're talking about poor service, not physical harm." "It was not just poor service," Damon replied firmly. "It was deliberate discrimination that culminated in an unnecessary flight diversion affecting every passenger. The compensation acknowledges both the inconvenienced and our commitment to meaningful change." "And this comprehensive reform package you're proposing," Victoria Hayes, another board member, indicated the thick folders distributed before the meeting. "Implementation costs alone would run into the millions. Consider the alternative," Damon responded. "Class action lawsuits, regulatory investigations, sustained reputational damage. Our passengers have smartphones, Victoria. The next incident won't just reach our boardroom. It will go viral globally within hours." Robert Lang nodded in agreement. "Damon is right. We have the option to lead this change proactively or be forced to do so reactively under far less favorable circumstances." The debate continued for hours, with some board members resisting acknowledgement of the systemic nature of the problem, while others pushed for even more aggressive enterprise-wide reforms. Damon held firm, consistently returning to the evidence rather than allowing the discussion to devolve into assumptions or defensive postures. "This isn't about assigning blame," he emphasized as the conversation neared its conclusion. "It's about building accountability into our systems so every passenger receives the service and respect they deserve, regardless of how they look or where they come from." In the end, the vote was not unanimous but decisive, favor of adopting the comprehensive reform package. The dissenters registered their concerns about costs and implementation challenges, while finally acknowledging that the status quo had become untenable. "We'll issue a public statement this afternoon," Robert announced as the meeting concluded. "Full transparency about what occurred, the actions we've taken in response, and our commitment to systemic reform going forward." As the boardroom emptied, Diane approached Damon with the initial implementation timeline already drafted on her tablet. "We can begin the enhanced training program next week. The expansion of the surveillance system will take longer, approximately 3 months for the full fleet." "Good," Damon nodded. "And the Discrimination Complaint Review Committee has already identified potential members, diverse both in terms of demographics and positions within the company. I'll need your final approval." "Of course." Damon smiled slightly, appreciating her initiative. "Send me the list tonight. I want people who understand what's at stake here, not just for the company, but for every passenger who trusts us with their journey." The first-class cabin of Elite Airways gleamed with morning sunlight as Damon settled into seat 2A, the same position he had occupied during that fateful flight months earlier. The transformation was evident not only in the recently updated interior, but in the subtle, yet significant changes in service culture that had taken root throughout the airline. Sarah Johnson, now the permanent lead flight attendant for the premium New York to San Francisco route, approached with a warm smile that carried none of the artificial difference that often characterized first-class service. "Good morning, Mr. Hale. Your pre-ordered drink and special meal have been noted. Can I offer you anything else before takeoff?" "Just the usual. Hot towel, please," Damon replied, returning her smile as he observed her interactions with other passengers, the consistent professionalism and genuine warmth she extended to every person, regardless of appearance or background. As Sarah moved through the cabin, she left an envelope on his tray table. "From the crew," she explained, before continuing with her preparations. Inside, Damon found a handwritten note signed by every member of the flight staff. "Mr. Hale, your courage months ago transformed not only our airline, but our industry. What began as a painful confrontation has become a model of change that airlines across the country are now following. We're proud to serve on an aircraft where every passenger truly receives first-class treatment. Thank you for setting the standard." The crew of Flight 347. Damon folded the note and slipped it into his jacket pocket, his mind returning briefly to the aftermath that had followed for the original crew of that flight. Lindsay Brooks, Tyler, and Captain Shaw had not gone quietly, as expected. They had attempted to fight their terminations through their union representatives, claiming they were being scapegoated for what they persisted in characterizing as a misunderstanding. Their efforts collapsed, however, when the complete surveillance footage was shared during arbitration hearings. The explicitly racial comments captured behind the galley curtain, combined with evidence of deliberately serving spoiled food, left no room for plausible denial. All three were permanently terminated from Elite Airways, with the incident documented in their employment records. But the consequences had not ended there. The Federal Aviation Administration had launched its own investigation into Captain Shaw's decision to divert the aircraft without legitimate safety concerns, ultimately suspending his commercial pilot's license for a period. More significantly, the incident had been incorporated into airline training programs nationwide as a case study on how bias can compromise safety and operational decisions. Lindsay Brooks had attempted to give interviews portraying herself as a victim of cancel culture, but found little sympathy, even among outlets normally receptive to such narratives. Once the surveillance footage became public, the last Damon heard, she was working for a regional airline relegated to short-haul economy routes and subject to stricter oversight. Yet the most significant outcome had not been punitive measures, but the structural reforms that had been catalyzed. The comprehensive training program implemented at Elite Airways had now been adopted by other major carriers. The Diverse Discrimination Complaint Review Committee had proven so effective it had been expanded to address other passenger service issues. And the surveillance system, now present in both premium and economy cabins, served as both deterrent and documentation, ensuring future incidents could not be dismissed as simple misunderstandings. As the plane began taxiing toward the runway, Damon opened his tablet to review the quarterly performance reports. Premium bookings at Elite Airways had increased, despite industry analysts' predictions that the publicized incident would damage the brand. The transparency with which the company had addressed the discrimination and its commitment to reform had resonated with travelers weary of corporate apologies without meaningful change. Captain Sophia Reyes's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard Flight 347 to San Francisco. Months earlier, Damon had boarded an aircraft where he was viewed as an intruder in a space not meant for people who looked like him. Today, he flew on a transformed airline. Not perfect, but actively striving to create an environment where dignity and respect were extended to every passenger, regardless of appearance. The crew's note crinkled in his pocket as the plane accelerated down the runway. The incident had never been about one meal, one diverted flight, or even one prejudiced crew. It had been about the simple but profound principle that spaces designed for everyone must truly welcome everyone, and about the recognition that meaningful change requires not only addressing individual incidents, but transforming the systems that allow them to occur. As the aircraft lifted into the clouds, Damon closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself to feel something that had eluded him on too many previous journeys. The simple pleasure of being treated not as an exception or an intruder, but simply as a passenger. Welcome aboard, without qualification or condition. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. In the meantime, I've selected 2 stories I think you'll enjoy. Have a great day.